During Christmas time, it is easy to get carried away and overspend. But during the Great Depression in the 1930s, overspending wasn't even an option. So to save money, people had to get creative with their gifts, their decorations, and even their food, with dishes like this 1931 recipe for an inexpensive Christmas pudding. This time on Tasting History. In the 1920s and 30s, there was a fictional radio character known as Aunt Sammy. She was supposedly the wife of Uncle Sam, and she would teach people how to cook and give recipes over the radio. And in December of 1931, she told her audience that a less expensive dinner for a thrifty Christmas can be just as good and just as Christmassy as one planned with all the frills and expensive items of food. She then goes on to give an entire inexpensive menu for a full Christmas dinner, an important thing to have in 1931, as most of the country, in fact most of the world, was in the depths of the Great Depression. Many people relied on soup kitchens and food drives during this time, but provided you were fortunate enough to be able to afford a full home-cooked meal for Christmas, then this menu could at least help with pinching the pennies. The first course was a hot tomato bouillon or cocktail with chopped parsley sprinkled on top, a festive mix of red and green. Then there's a main course of baked smoked ham, buttered cauliflower, creamed spinach, candied sweet potatoes, celery, cranberry sauce, and pickles, all with recipes that make the dishes less expensive than they would traditionally be. But it's the dessert that really intrigues me, because it is for a chocolate plum pudding. But instead of being the old-fashioned, steaming hot plum pudding, is made with gelatin and served cold with whipped cream. So that's what I'm going to make, and it requires 2 tablespoons of granulated gelatin, 1 cup or 235 milliliters of cold water, 1 pint or 475 milliliters of milk, 1 cup or 200 grams of sugar, 1.5 ounces or 45 grams of unsweetened chocolate, 1 teaspoon of salt, a half teaspoon of vanilla, 1 cup or 150 grams of raisins, 3/4 of a cup or 100 grams of chopped dates, a half cup or 60 grams of chopped nuts, a half cup or 70 grams of dried currants, and 3 egg whites. You also need some either walnut or pecan halves and some raisins for decorating the pudding. Now, I'm not exactly sure how this is less expensive than a traditional pudding, or at least much less expensive. It is missing a few of the spices, but by this time, spices weren't all that expensive, so not exactly sure. But if I learned anything from watching Mickey's Christmas Carol when I was a little kid, then I learned that time is money. So perhaps this is a less expensive pudding simply because it takes a lot less time to make than a boiled or steamed pudding. Now, when Aunt Sammy introduced America to this inexpensive Christmas pudding, she read out the entire recipe on the radio. And it's so well written that I can pretty much just say what she said as we walk through the recipe. She says to make this pudding, first soften the gelatin in the cold water for 10 minutes. While the gelatin is soaking, melt the chocolate with part of the sugar. She's not specific with how much sugar, so I just added a couple tablespoons. Then she says when it is melted, add a little of the milk, just enough to make a smooth paste. Then in a different pot, heat up the rest of the milk until it is steaming, and when the milk is hot, add it to the melted chocolate, then the sugar and salt, and finally the soaked gelatin. Stir the mixture, then remove it from the fire. Set it away to grow cold. And you can do this by either leaving it out to cool down slowly, or to speed things up, put it in the refrigerator, but keep a close eye on it because you don't want it to fully solidify. You want to catch it just as it's starting to thicken up. When it begins to thicken, add the vanilla, the fruit, and the chopped nut meats. Mix all of this in, and then in a clean bowl, beat the egg whites until you have nice stiff peaks. Then fold in the beaten egg whites. Then she has you prepare a pudding mold, and these can be all sorts of different things, but the traditional Christmas plum pudding style is basically just a bowl. It's a pudding basin. It's a bowl with a slightly flat bottom. So pick something like that, wet the inside, and then line the bottom with the walnut or pecan halves as well as the additional raisins. Then pour the pudding mixture into the mold and smooth the top. Then set it in the fridge to fully firm up before serving, and while it firms up, we can look at just how Christmas was celebrated during the Great Depression. The Great Depression came in the aftermath of the stock market crash in 1929. It actually took several years for it to hit its lowest point, and then it lasted throughout the 1930s. And while it hit some people harder than others, few went untouched, and generally the entire decade was rather bleak. And because of this, it was really important for people to celebrate those things that did bring them joy, like Christmas. Christmas was such a big thing to us. The bell on Christmas Eve, the candles on the tree, that's what I remember. I don't remember the sadness of my parents. We loved books, we loved music, and we made Christmas cards of beautiful little tissue paper baskets. And that was a common thing during this period, making your own Christmas. You'd make your own gifts, you'd make Christmas cards, and even the decorations. It was common to decorate the Christmas tree with garlands made of cut paper and strings of popcorn and cranberries, though some opted for the slightly more expensive tinsel icicles that we were still using when I was a kid. And my mother hated those things. They would get caught in the vacuum cleaner and break it, and they would get dragged all over the house, so she was still finding them in July. Finally, we stopped using them. Of course, when I was a kid, they were made of a very different material than back in the 1930s. Originally, they were actually made of silver, but that would tarnish very quickly, so they switched over to lead, which didn't tarnish. Poisoned you, but it didn't tarnish. Lead was actually the go-to for tinsel up until the 1960s. This was also the period that candles on the tree, a major fire hazard, really started to go out of fashion. It was partly because it's really dangerous, but also because as part of the New Deal, the US government started its Rural Electrification Act, and this put a lot of people to work extending the power grid to much of the country that had yet to receive it, and with that, instead of candles, you could string lights on your tree. Of course, they also got incredibly hot, much hotter than they do today, and they did start a lot of fires, but probably less fires than the candles. Another semi-do-it-yourself Christmas decoration were called putz houses, and these were little houses and buildings that were made out of cardboard, and they'd usually put them under the tree or out in some other place and make a little Christmas village. And eventually these turned into the ceramic Christmas villages, which are still popular today. I am a personal collector of the Charles Dickens themed sets. Now, when it came to Christmas presents, a lot of things were homemade, and if they were purchased, they really needed to be practical for most people. There was one man who was raised by a single mother during the Depression who recalled that he got no toys. Maybe a couple pairs of socks, but nothing you could really play with. And no Christmas tree. We'd have burned that for heat in the pot-bellied stove. You couldn't get angry about it. In your heart, you knew the lady was doing the best she could. And she always made sure we had a decent dinner. She was a very strong woman, and we realized she was having a rough go. It'd just tear you apart, really. One woman who grew up in Brooklyn during the Depression recalled getting the same doll every year for Christmas, but her mother would make sure that the doll at least had a new set of clothes. I knew it was an old doll because it never had any bloomers. My mother couldn't make bloomers. I never let my mother know I knew. Perhaps the most iconic gift of the Great Depression was food itself, specifically oranges. Oranges were not a new thing to find stuffed in the bottom of a Christmas stocking, but it was very popular during the Depression because many people couldn't afford citrus for most of the year, so it was a real treat. My Nana, who grew up in New York City in the 1930s, always told me about how excited they were to get nuts and an orange in their stocking. And she actually continued that tradition. She would put it in my mom and aunt's stockings, and then our stockings when we were kids. And now my mom actually continues the tradition, putting an orange in my niece's stockings. I don't think it is as exciting as it was in the 1930s, but I still love that the tradition is continuing. There's actually a child's letter that I found from 1931, and it's a letter to Santa, and it kind of gives you an idea of what a kid during this time could expect to get for presents. Dear Santa, I thought as Christmas is not so very long off, I had better write you. I want you to please bring me a string of beads and a ring. Also, bring me lots of fruits, nuts, and candy. Don't forget the orphans and my little friend Dave. I think he wants a billy goat, a wagon, and a pair of pajamas so he won't get cold. I'm very curious if Dave ever got his billy goat. Now, while there were a lot of homemade gifts at this time, there were also a lot of toys and games for purchase that became super popular during the Depression if you could afford them. Things like the yo-yo, which had actually been around for thousands of years, had a boost in popularity with the introduction of the iconic Duncan yo-yo in the 1930s. Board games like Chinese checkers and Sorry were all the rage, and in 1935, Monopoly became the must-have gift for all ages. And I do find it somewhat ironic that one of the most popular games at the time was Monopoly during the Great Depression. Yin and yang. This was also the decade of the Little Orphan Annie toys, and Little Lulu and Betsy Wetsy dolls were popular. And perhaps the most coveted doll for any little girl was the Shirley Temple doll. She was so famous during this period, so her doll was on a lot of people's wish list. Though her fame actually kind of ruined some of her own Christmas innocence in 1934. I stopped believing in Santa Claus when I was 6. Mother took me to see him in a department store, and he asked for my autograph. Shopping for Christmas gifts like these dolls and board games was actually kind of part of the recovery effort for the economy. And in 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt actually moved Thanksgiving up a week to the second to the last Thursday in November, just to give people 7 more days of Christmas shopping, hoping that it might give an extra boost to the economy. Though the change didn't seem to really do much for the economy, but it did make a lot of people mad because, people don't like change, and so it was derisively often called Franksgiving. But even without the additional week of Christmas shopping, stores like Sears and Macy's did much of their business throughout the month of December, and at least in Macy's, this led to a new department which employed thousands of people every year, and that was the gift wrapping department. Scotch tape was introduced in 1930, and there were big advancements in the technology of printed paper that was not super expensive. And so this led Macy's every year to hire an army of women at $14 a week to wrap the gifts. Now, even then, $14 a week was not a lot of money, but it was enough money that it would allow the people to buy some Christmas gifts and make a good Christmas dinner for their family. We always had a big meal. We might have soup for a couple days before Christmas, but my parents thought it was important to keep the tradition of having something special. Other Christmas traditions, many of which could be done on the cheap, that got popular during the Great Depression were things like ice skating in front of Rockefeller Center, the rink being opened on Christmas Day 1936. And from there you could look up and see the iconic Christmas tree which they started putting up in 1931. And in 1933, just down the street at Radio City Music Hall, the Rockettes began the tradition of the Radio City Christmas Spectacular. And you could get tickets for as little as 35 cents, though if you couldn't even afford that, you could at least listen to a bunch of Christmas music on the radio, because this decade gave us a lot of the Christmas music that we still listen to today. Things like Santa Claus is Coming to Town, Winter Wonderland, and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, except it wasn't actually in song form yet. That took place in the 1940s. At first, it was just a storybook, written as part of a marketing campaign for the retailer Montgomery Ward. But if you'd been hit especially hard by the economic downturn and couldn't afford tickets to Radio City or the Rudolph book, well, that doesn't mean that you couldn't still have a Merry Christmas. One of my favorite things that I found while researching this episode was actually a Christmas card, a homemade Christmas card from the Pinheiro family of Chicago. It's from the Christmas of 1933, and they made it out of cut-up brown paper bags, and on it they wrote a poem, and it really conveys how people were feeling during the holidays at this time. In days gone by, when we were broke, we hated to reveal it. In fact, our pride demanded that we struggled to conceal it. But now at last we're right in style and need not fear confession. We shrug and smile and say, oh well, it's merely this depression. And so this card, which once we'd scorn, now seems within all reason. It's cheap, and yet it brings to you best wishes of the season. And so it was all about finding something inexpensive that could still provide the warmth of the holiday season. Whether it was a homemade Christmas card, popcorn on the tree, or an inexpensive recipe for a Christmas pudding. So once the pudding is firmed up, dip it into some simmering water and/or wrap it in a hot towel to loosen it from the bowl, and then you can release it onto a serving plate. Aunt Sammy then says to serve the pudding with whipped cream sweetened and flavored with vanilla or with a currant jelly sauce. I opted for the whipped cream, which just needs a cup of heavy whipping cream along with a quarter cup of powdered sugar and a teaspoon of vanilla. Whisk it all together until you have lovely thick whipped cream, which can be piped around the pudding. And here we are, an inexpensive alternative to Christmas pudding from the Great Depression. So you can tell right away it's a very different texture than a boiled or steamed Christmas pudding. I mean, look at that wobble. I cut a piece out and it holds together. It's nice and firm. So let's give it a try. It is more firm than like pudding. It's almost like, well, it's a little gelatinous. That's really good. The flavor is really, really nice. You can taste the chocolate, you can taste the fruit. I really, really like it. I did just realize there are uncooked egg whites in it, to which I am somewhat allergic. So my mouth has gone a bit numb. I'm gonna be fine. but I'm not gonna have any more. Really need to pay better attention to that. The flavor is great. The texture, I wish it was a little smoother maybe. And I don't really know what you could do to achieve that and still have it hold together. I think to get the shape of it to hold, you do have to use that much gelatin. So it's not like pudding like we think of pudding here in the US today that's really smooth. It is a little more firm, more like a jelly mold, but much better tasting. So I hope everyone is able to celebrate a wonderful holiday season this year, make some wonderful Christmas foods. It's my favorite time of year for cooking, baking, just in general. So yeah, I am going to go take some Benadryl, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.